Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Transfigured. I am very excited today. This is very special. I have two guests. I have John Vervaeke returning for his third appearance. And for the first time ever, I have Pastor Paul Vanderklay. It's funny, I told Paul that, this is the first time you've ever been on my channel, and he was surprised to know that. Because we've talked so many times, but mainly over on his channel. I guess to introduce Paul, Paul is a pastor of Livingstone's Church, Christian Reformed Church in Sacramento, California. You have your own YouTube channel that is hard to classify, some combination of philosophy, theology, cultural commentary, and etc. So I'm excited to have Paul here. Paul had commented on my last conversation with John that you wanted in, and so be careful what you wish for, because here you are. And John, this is in case anyone's coming to this episode for the first time, Dr. John Vervaeke is a professor of cognitive psychology at the University of Toronto. And he also has his own YouTube channel. I would recommend his series, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, which is a 50 video series kind of on the history of philosophy and intellectual history and psychology and cognitive science, and sort of how we have found ourselves in the situation that we're in. So first off, welcome to both of you. I'm very glad to have you. And I think that this conversation will be sort of picking up on a lot of conversations that have already happened. If you're just coming to this one for the first time, there's a decent amount of homework, but hopefully it'll be interesting as a standalone thing itself. But this is sort of in the stream of conversations that I've had with John, that John and Paul have had with each other, and also other people like Paul Anleitner and Jonathan Pageau and a whole bunch of other people. So I sort of view this as kind of continuing in the stream of a lot of those conversations. So I guess to sort of give a little bit of background on things that we've talked about and lay the groundwork for what we could talk about this time. I feel like part of the conversation, the first conversation that John and I had, was a lot about Neoplatonism. John self-identifies as strongly influenced and even somewhat in the Neoplatonic tradition. And I've had interest in Neoplatonism mainly to try and figure out exactly where the Trinity came from and why. And Neoplatonism has an important part of that story. But that was sort of my original reason for looking into it. But then it eventually became interesting enough in its own worth, I guess, to keep learning and exploring about that. And I think the interesting part that our conversations have revolved around is sort of the intersection between, I guess, science and especially evolution, and how that relates to Neoplatonic ideas in our current situation, and sort of bridging the gap between, I guess, science and faith a little bit, but also doing this in a dialogue where John is you call yourself a non-theist. You are influenced by and very knowledgeable of the Christian tradition, but you are not in the Christian tradition, whereas Paul Vanderklay, Paul Anleitner, myself, and Jonathan Pageau are often sort of representing the Christian side of the dialogue in these discussions. But these dialogues are not debates. They're very much in the spirit of mutual learning and exploration. And I think that John, more than anyone, has done a good job modeling how that process works and what that looks like. And a good dialogue, it takes a little bit of difference to have a dialogue be interesting, but it also takes a fair amount of overlap for a dialogue to be productive, and it takes good faith for it to go in a positive direction and not a negative direction. And so I feel like the old dialogues between Christians and atheists are sort of wearing out. I think, John, you sort of said in your recent conversation with Paul Anleitner that that the debates between, like, say, William Lane Craig and Sam Harris seemed somewhat futile,
Yes.
right? They might have millions of views on YouTube, but what exactly they accomplished, where they went, how much they increased mutual understanding is questionable. But something brought millions of people to watch those things. Something kept millions of people listening. But at the end, it sort of seemed like a dead end. And I would say that there's sort of a new focus happening in, I guess, sort of Christian, non-Christian dialogues that I think is very different than the old tenor. And I think that there is interesting new overlap, but also interesting new points of disagreement. And I've sort of made, I guess, over the last two conversations, I've built up something almost like an evolutionary argument for Christianity. And this is sort of ironic, I guess, for me. I grew up in a creationist church that, you know, very much distrusted Darwin, very much viewed that as sort of a not only wrong, but a dangerous influence on American culture and the culture of the West, and would connect it with Nazism and stuff like that. And that Christianity was very much defined as opposed to Darwin's theory of evolution. And that was sort of, I was that feisty kid in high school that read all of those intelligent design books and would pester my public high school biology teacher with questions that he couldn't answer, and viewed myself as somewhat, you know, proud to be able to do that sort of thing. But then Paul's laughing because you know what I'm talking about. But I guess in college, I don't know, I guess I changed my mind on that topic. And that was one of the biggest sort of deconstruction, reconstruction things that happened to me, especially early on. And honestly, I would say the main reason why that happened was that I met Christians in college that believed in evolution, whose faith I respected. I think that was probably the biggest ingredient for me changing my mind on that. In addition to, like, going to a museum and being like, okay, why do whales have hip bones? All right, that doesn't really make sense at some level. Okay, but and so I then, like, I've always been fascinated by evolution, but I still honestly struggle to fit it in with Genesis and Christianity. And Paul, you've said that that's one of the big things that motivates your interest is, how do we deal with the Bible, which is this very strange book from a very different culture that had very different views of the world in terms of cosmology and geology and biology and all sorts of things. How do we interact with that sort of stuff in our current culture? And, like, even though I changed my mind on evolution, I still didn't have, like, comfortable answers to all of the questions that brings up. And when Jordan Peterson started talking about Genesis, I felt like he captured my attention because he was helping me make progress on those questions that had been lingering unhelped for a long time. So I guess, you know, the evolutionary argument for Christianity would be something like, you know, humans evolved to be a very social animal. We came from primates that lived in small social groups, probably only a couple hundred max. Through language and cognitive abilities, we are able to expand our group size so that we could cooperate together, larger amounts of resources, control larger amounts of territory, and compete with other groups that were smaller than our groups. One of the key ingredients for holding groups together was religion. Religion seems to be a near human universal. Virtually every culture that we're aware of that has survived for any amount of time has had some amount of religion. Religion seems to serve purposes of unifying a group. It seems to serve purposes of helping control moral and ethical behavior within the group. But religion can vary a lot. There's sort of similarity and differences between all the religions of the world, just as the same way that there's sort of similarity and differences between language. I can say that Chinese is a language, Hindi is a language, English is a language. They share this common structures of language, but there are also differences in grammar, vocabulary, etc. Same with religion. There seems to be pattern and variation on different religions. Okay, so if religions help groups of humans be better groups, then seemingly a religion could be better or worse at that function, if that's one of its purposes. And over time, Christianity has seemingly, in a very weird manner, beaten out most of its rivals, although it should be noted that it hasn't won total victory. But it, through means that we would commend and means that we wouldn't really commend, Christianity has spread. And that seems to suggest that there's something true about it based off of its sort of evolutionary success. And that all humans seemingly have this religious hardware in their minds, and that it needs to be utilized and directed and organized somehow. And Christianity seems to be the best way of doing that we can see. So that would be something like an evolutionary argument for Christianity. And this is, I'm not unique in coming up with this. I feel like Adam Friended has said similar things. You can almost see the roots of some of this idea. Like David Sloan Wilson is an evolutionary biologist who has laid down some of the roots of kind of this idea that I'm working with, but it also has some weaknesses. So I feel like that's I feel like this is going to be something like the centerpiece of Christian, non-Christian dialogue in going forward. And in a weird way, when I was growing up in the 90s and 2000s, evolutionary biology was used against Christians, and Christians either had to find some way of harmonizing it or some way of kind of undermining evolutionary biology. But I feel like one thing that's happened in the recent decades is that the tables have really turned in terms of seeing that religion isn't just like a competitor to science, right? In the William Lane Craig, Sam Harris days, science and religion were competitors for the same slot. But if you expand religion to be more than just something that's truth claims about the universe, truth claims about cosmology and origins and stuff like that, but instead of it just being something that you state to be true, you say it's something that you do, it's something that you act out, it's also something that you do with other people, it's something that other people do with you, it's also something that competitor groups might do differently, then it changes the topic. And then I think that evolution was also overly narrowly focused on genetics and biology, and that it didn't have a good way of incorporating things like culture or there was sort of a common belief that like evolution explained how humans got to 10,000 BC, and then from 10,000 BC onwards we're in history, and history is somehow decoupled or detached from the process of evolution. That doesn't happen anymore. It's interesting for thinking about what life was like on the savannah, but when we're wondering about why did the Chaldeans, lose to the Persians, well, that's just history. That's not evolutionary biology. But I think that sort of idea is slipping away, and that that biology is having to increasingly focus on what you might call sort of the soft layer of human cultural transmission that is in our minds and in our behavior, as much as the transmission that's in our genetics. And that this sort of brings increasing focus on what exactly is religion, what is its role, and how does the success of a religion, what credibility does it give to the metaphysical claims of the successful religions by virtue of the fact that they are successful? Are they just sort of these self-deceptive mind viruses that accord fitness, but they do it in a way that has no connection to the truth of the matter? They just have a way of getting groups to behave in the way that causes them to succeed, even though they're basically fanciful, deceptive lies? Or is it that the groups that are successful because what they are saying is true? Or is it somewhere in the middle? And Bret Weinstein has distinctions between metaphorical truth and whatever the opposite of metaphorical truth is, literal truth, scientific truth, something like that. And so you could say religions like Christianity, they make up things like heaven and hell and all of this theology to kind of positively motivate and negatively motivate behavior and groups. And yeah, it works, but that isn't because heaven or hell is real or because Jesus rose from the dead. It's because these things hyperactivate or whatever motivate behaviors into doing what works, even though it's not based off of the truth of the matter. It's like a Santa Claus sort of thing, right? We use Santa Claus to scare our kids into good behavior for the couple months leading up to Christmas, and it has some amount of functional success, but it is not because Santa Claus is up at the North Pole, watching everything you do and keeping a list of who's naughty and nice, right? So I guess I'll stop my intro monologue there, but I feel like this is sort of the place where I feel like, or at least in my mind, these are the questions that I've been wrestling with, and I feel like, John, you've been an excellent conversation partner in this, and I'm excited to see what Paul has to say, because I think, Paul, you won't be surprised by anything that I've just said. I feel like a lot of the arguments that I laid down are sort of in the air, and I'm just kind of collecting and trying to articulate them. So I'll pass the microphone to whichever of you wants to pick it up next after that.
I'd like to pick it up next, because I think that there's an argument that I've been working on. It's emerging, and I think this is now a place to try and see if you two can help me draw it out and assess its pertinence, its relevance, and perhaps its plausibility. And so I think the evolutionary argument for Christianity bumps into the problem that you said, Sam, and this is, Bret and I are supposed to talk, but we keep missing our calendars, refuse to intersect. And this is sort of Bret's notion of metaphorical truth. What metaphorical truth means, it's an acknowledgement without an explication of that there's multiple ways of knowing, and those ways of knowing work in terms of different standards of contact with reality. There's truth, but functions, you don't talk about if functions are true or false. You talk about if they function, are they powerful, do they intervene? So it's possible for something to be propositionally false, but procedurally or functionally powerful, and that, right? That's the gist of the argument. So part of what I think people are invoking when they invoke that distinction are the four ways of knowing, without adequately explicating their psychology and their epistemology, etc. So I think that invocation in and of itself, while promising, is still promissory, and it needs to develop this much more in order for that argument to get clearer. If you follow that out, you follow out the possibility that we could say things that are propositionally false that are functionally powerful. And then that means that there is no direct translation between the functionality and perhaps our metaphysical claims. I believe, Sam, that's the way you're articulating. So there is no clear inference. Look, Christianity works too, therefore Christianity is true. Any more than, look, the placebo works, and therefore it really is medicine rather than the placebo, right? So we know that there is no valid inference there. But on the other hand, we should point out, well, but there's an issue. The issue is, it's not a good thing for your functionality, for your power and your truth to be disconnected from each other. One way of pointing to a lot of key problems in our culture is precisely the disjointedness, the uncoupledness we have between the pursuit of power and the pursuit of truth, for example, in our society. So leaving those two things disconnected, or perhaps even antagonistic towards each other, I think is very dangerous. And so I think what you need is something that bridges between the functionality and the phenomenology and the ontology. So bridge between how it's functioning for you psychologically, how it may structure your experience, and then how it may disclose the nature of reality. And I want to make a proposal here, because it's a proposal I've been working on, and it's a historical argument, but it also fits in with the structural argument. I think the thing that did that for Christianity, that made that work, that took, look, it's functioning within, right? I don't want to be reductive here. And so I'm just using the terms you're using, right? It's functioning culturally, it's binding us together as a group, and it's definitely functioning psychologically. Our phenomenology, our experience is meaningful, right? And then there were ontological claims. Now, initially, the Bible is kind of sort of vague on the ontology, right? And so I don't want to misrepresent the Bible. I'm not doing that, okay? I want that really clear. I'm not doing that. I'm not attributing things, okay? The Bible says really provocative and strange things about ontology, but the Bible says provocative and strange things about sex. I mean, the Bible's just like that. That's the kind of book it is. I mean, that's said with respect. That's not said with any kind of antagonism at all. Okay, I think the thing that did that bridged between the phenomenology and functionality of Christianity and claims to a plausible ontology was precisely Neoplatonism. I think that was its historical role. I think that's what it did. I think it made the case, because you can make a case. Here's how you make the case. You point to a particular kind of functionality, the functionality of intelligibility. And then you say, note, there's a deep connection between how intelligible things are and how plausibly we can judge them to be real. And therefore, I can go from the functionality, the psychological functionality, to the functionality of intelligibility to the ontology. That's what Neoplatonism offered. I think that's why it got taken up. But here's the point. Neoplatonism was taken up for similar reasons in other religions. It's taken up into Islam, into Sufism. It's taken up into Judaism, into Kabbalah. There's now clear evidence that it probably interacted with forms of Buddhism in this way. So Thomas Plant has a book about, we had the Silk Road of trade, but we also had the Silk Road of cultural overlap. And the thing that allowed all of these people not to agree, but to work together in good dialogue was Neoplatonism. It was sort of the common space that the different religions could come into and talk about. It was, if you'll allow me to borrow language from both Paul and myself, it was a shared arena in which people could come in, and the grammar of that arena was well understood. They didn't know, there was very little attempts to convert, but it was, no, we can equally recognize wisdom and virtue in each other, because we can recognize people's orientation towards what's true, good, and beautiful because of this shared Neoplatonic framework. So although they wouldn't share their particular metaphysics, right, in depth, because there'd be differences, like, Islam is non-Trinitarian, Christianity is Trinitarian, things like
Sometimes.
that. Well, yeah, sorry, Sam, that was presumptuous. I meant statistically predominantly.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Sorry, that was really unintentional, my friend.
Yeah, that's okay.
And so Neoplatonism argued precisely that, because it tapped into something that I think they all did share. All the religions do share the functionality you mentioned, or for the very evolutionary arguments you give, they would not be around. So there's something highly functional about it. But what they did, what Neoplatonism helped people say, is that functionality is not just sort of survival. It's not just sort of biological and group, survival. There's a functionality in the cultivation of wisdom and virtue, which are properly understood ultimately as orientations to what's true, good, and beautiful, that's there. And that functionality, what I'm calling the functionality of intelligibility, has to say something about reality. Because if the functionality of intelligibility does not direct us towards reality, then science itself is also completely undermined and destroyed. This is the key Neoplatonic move. If you deny the functionality of intelligibility, and if you deny that our ontology is built around understanding that as profoundly as we can, then you destroy the very fabric within which science works and the set of presuppositions that it needs in order to operate. And I think this is why Neoplatonism was the philosophical Silk Road of the ancient world. Now, I want to be very clear about what I'm not proposing. I'm not proposing we can go back to ancient Neoplatonism. We can't. I keep saying it on my tombstone, neither nostalgia nor utopia. We can't go back, right? And there is
ancient Neoplatonism was kind of weird too.
There's a lot of weird
stuff.
There's weird stuff, and the thing is that the weird stuff is a lot of the variation that gets introduced, and it gets called out very much like you would see. And I'm not saying that evolution doesn't like push towards perfection or something like that. It produces because it doesn't make any sense to say what's the final form of life. That doesn't make any sense. but what it does is it can move up levels. And this is part of what you and I were starting to explore, Sam. You can move from evolution, and this is even coming up in biology right now. You can move from evolution of a trait like strength or height or speed to evolution of a meta trait, the evolution of evolvability. Mm-hmm. And what I'm proposing is that Neoplatonism was sort of had moved in that direction in a powerful way. I think we need a post-Neoplatonic, naturalistic, meaning very consonant with our science, like the Neoplatonism of the ancient world was consonant with its sciences. We need that. We need a post-nominalist, naturalistic Neoplatonist. So we're adding lots of N's and P's to our Neoplatonism. Now, what am I not proposing? I'm not proposing a totalitarianism of this. What I'm proposing is exactly this, that this is, if we could, first of all, this is something we could all craft together, because we could bring in variation and then put different selective pressures on it, if you allow me the evolutionary argument. We could do collective relevance realization, and we could build this new space in which we could carry out dialogos with each other. It's not an attempt to say, no, we're going to replace all the religions with this. That's ridiculous. But Neoplatonism seems to have proven that it has this functionality. It can enter into profound reciprocal reconstruction with other deep wisdom traditions and religions. It did it with Christianity. Interestingly, it did it with Christianity, with Eastern Orthodoxy, and then with Catholicism, sort of independently, back through with Aquinas. Right? It does it with Islam. It does it with Judaism. It looks like there's increasing evidence it did, and it is now doing it with Buddhism. You can see that also prefigured in the Kyoto School. I'm a little bit. I don't know enough of the history about Taoism and Hinduism. I do know that there have been fruitful sort of discussions about the relationships between things like Vedanta and Neoplatonism. Arthur Versluis has said it's pretty much the spiritual grammar of the West. And one last note, it was the hidden driver behind the first scientific revolution, the Neoplatonic framework, especially Renaissance Neoplatonism, and also the second scientific revolution with Einstein and quantum mechanics. The Neoplatonic framework gave people that dojo in which they could develop, right, the new ways of moving in thought that allowed for the second scientific revolution. So I'm recommending that this is how we could bring all of this together, that Neoplatonism has had a history of providing what is needed, which is a bridging argument between the functionality and the ontology. It has a proven track record of doing that, both within the ancient religious world and even within the current modern scientific world. And that's the proposal I wanted to put on the table of how to this will probably sound paradoxical, how to potentially strengthen your own position, but also strengthen allow it to enter into stronger dialogos with other people's positions.
That's a bold proposal.
Well, I said I wanted to try it out here. I wanted to try it out with people that I respect and I can enter into fellowship, and that nevertheless, have significant differences. So I'll be quiet. I want to hear what you have to say.
Well, it's an interesting proposal. There are different aspects to it that are interesting, and it's one of, I assume part of the reason we haven't gotten the sequels to Awakening from the Meaning Crisis is that the process by which you put out that series required things that COVID has disrupted, I assume. Yes. And so I look forward to you fleshing out this proposal. I was, so yesterday I started working a little bit on the recent Rebel Wisdom video about the sort of the religious aspect of the pandemic endgame that David put out. I thought that was an excellent video. And, there are a couple of clips that he had of some work that you did with them in that video. And so there's sort of a historical aspect to a proposal like this, which would want to track the, not just the presence of something that we can identify as Neoplatonism, and in terms of a historical framework, that this, and it's tremendously difficult talking about these things, because even when we use a word like Neoplatonism or Christianity or all these words, it's like, well, what's the thing underneath that is the essence of the tribal or philosophical schools label that we're using? And because I think, as Sam said, Neoplatonism, I haven't done a lot of work on Neoplatonism, but since, John, you've been elevating that in the conversation, I've been looking at some more things and tinkering with some more things. It's in some ways, the one way to think about it would be sort of the third instantiation of Platonism. There's, let's say, Platonism, and then Middle Platonism, and then Neoplatonism. Yeah. And that itself, those who would identify within that tradition would then likely appropriate it in different ways as history continues to move forward. And, Christianity does exactly that same thing, even though, many people who go to church might easily imagine that what they're doing in their air-conditioned North American spaces is exactly the air of Paul of Tarsus, let's say. And even though I imagine that Paul of Tarsus lived in a very different world than most of us do today, but yet there's something, we imagine that there's sort of I was going to say a narrative thread, but that word gets interesting too. But there's somehow some thread that ties Jesus, Paul of Tarsus. And again, I had lunch with Jacob, one of our Hasidic Jew on the Discord server, talking about Jesus he loves, but Paul he hates. And
Jacob
so there's
also loves Neoplatonism too.
Yes, he does. So that's a very interesting proposal, and I'm quite excited to hear more.
Yes, I understand it's promissory.
No, I get that, and that's not. And there's no denying the significant role of Neoplatonism in, let's say, even my own sub-tradition of Christianity, which is the Reformed tradition, which very much leans on Augustine, of course.
Yes, of course.
So it's a very interesting proposal. And I guess my initial questions would be to more greatly define, if we could, what we're talking about with respect to the Arenic images of Neoplatonism that afforded, on one hand, enough intelligibility between often warring traditions, although Islam and Christianity and Judaism weren't always, they had major periods where places in the world the three could.
Toledo,
that's right. And because part of what challenges us in these conversations, and this is, so I just made a little introductory video that's releasing at the same time we're having this conversation this morning, but I didn't get a chance to the portion of your conversation with Rebel Wisdom, where we get into, we have a hermeneutic of suspicion. We get into all these two-level theories, where on one hand we say, well, here's Christianity at the top with its narrative, with its tradition, with its ritual, all the things that three-dimensional historical human beings need to have the functional religion to afford the benefits that Sam just sort of outlined in terms of what religion has to offer. But is there something beneath the surface? And how we conceptualize that, we usually think of it as an idea. Lately I've been dabbling more with the question of a spirit, something a little bit more agentic, that is sort of the thing underneath that is working. And then we're always then struggling to deal with the thing itself, the essence, versus how that then gets manifest in all of the cultural and historical dynamics that goes on in terms of how we flesh these things out in our performative lives. So that would be just an initial thought on the bold proposal. I like bold proposals. I think the world needs more bold proposals, but bold proposals in an environment where we are practicing this kind of dialogos, to me, is especially exciting, where usually bold proposals are met with, hostility and anger and, entrenchment. So I love it.
Well, just before Sam replies, I want to say the boldness of the proposal is explicitly, and always should be explicitly, in the service of furthering dialogos. That is explicitly why I'm making the proposal, and I'm arguing that it has that explicit functionality, and so those two points are I think I'm arguing they're inseparably bound together. And the proposal is in the service of, well, how could we deeply, transhistorically, transculturally, transreligiously ground dialogos? Because we seem to be, and I'm not trying to be presumptuous or pretentious here, but there seems to be agreement about the value of this and the need for this. And so I just wanted to say that is part of the proposal. And this goes back to something, just remind about trying to replace the courtroom with the courtyard. And I think of the courtyard being the furniture is arranged and the plants are disposed in the courtyard by Neoplatonism. It's sort of the feng shui, mixing metaphors crazily here, of the courtyard, so that people feel comfortable to enter into it and enter into dialogos within it. And I'm proposing that as a space alternative to the courtyard, where we have adversarial debate as how we try to resolve these issues. And I think Harris and Craig, or Harris and even Peterson, Jordan, that was still taking place in the courtroom. It was a courtroom of public opinion, but that doesn't really matter. It was still the courtroom. And I'm trying to say, no, there is a deep way we can ground the courtyard and draw people in, where they will be drawn into it and they will feel comfortable in it and they will feel enabled in it and they will be drawn into dialogos. So that's I just want to be clear. I'm happy to discuss, and even when it's appropriate, debate the arguments around it, but that is the intent. That's the purpose I'm proposing.
Yeah, so on my YouTube channel, I've been doing a Church Fathers series where I kind of go through the early Church Fathers with my buddy Hank about once a month. And we are doing Origen of Alexandria right now. And I've done 3 out of 4 of our videos on Origen of Alexandria. And so Origen is fascinating because it seems to me highly historically plausible that he had the same philosophical teacher as Plotinus, and that
he and Plotinus met too.
Yes, and they don't talk about each other very much. And like, maybe it wasn't obvious back then how important each of them would be, and but maybe it was, I don't know. But and Origen was actually, I think, something like 15 years older than Plotinus, if I'm getting my dates correct. But so I've been knee deep, reading books like Origen's On First Principles. Shout out to Sherry.
I'm going to order that and Origen's Essential Writings, because I'm in the midst of trying to understand Maximus, the Confessor. You can't understand Maximus without understanding Origen.
Right.
The connections are deep.
So also, I'd recommend this translation by John Baer. It's the best, newest translation. The book's a little expensive and hard to come by, which is why I had someone send it to me from British Columbia. But I'd recommend that translation. But so I feel like I've been knee deep in this, and Origen is right there at the beginning. I mean, there are a couple of people who were Platonist philosophers who became Christians before Origen, like Justin Martyr and Athenagoras and a couple other people. But Origen is right there at the origin of sort of Neoplatonism and its real strong admixture and interactions with Christianity. And Jacob, who is mentioned by Paul, he's one of the main Jewish voices on Paul's Discord. He will say things like, I see a lot. He almost became a rabbi. He might have even been a rabbi for a while. I'm sorry if I'm mixing up your biography out there, Jacob. But he was also learned a lot about Kabbalah and the mystic tradition of Judaism. He will probably humbly say that he didn't know very much about this, but he clearly does seem to know a lot about it. But for him, he will make arguments like, I think that Neoplatonism was just a Kabbalistic lab leak into the pagan culture in Alexandria, and I'm not sure if we want to give the pagans credit for this. I think they swiped our esoteric stuff, and that's what Neoplatonism was, and actually it was Jewish. And
the Sufis do the same thing, by the way. They talk about Plotinus, but Sufism was way before Plotinus. They make the same kinds of arguments. Yes.
All right, and one could point out that one of the most prominent examples that we have of Middle Platonism is Philo of Alexandria, who is Jewish. And maybe it's just because we have his writings because Christians found him useful, and some of the other pagan predecessors to him were not kept down for the purpose of memory. But
I would make a stronger argument. He actually helps move Platonism towards Neoplatonism. The idea that the idea that the forms are ideas in the mind of God, that's a significant move towards Neoplatonism. The idea that the patterns of intelligibility have a dynamic, a living structure, and are not just static, isolated things. That's a very important. I think he contributes. I'm not saying he's a Neoplatonist. That would be false. But I'm saying that move seems to have been, whether or not he's the sole origin of that move, I don't know. But that move is important. So I think that, I think the connections are quite intimate.
Yeah, and so I kind of the general point that I'm making is it's not entirely clear whether Neoplatonism belongs to the pagans, whether it belongs to the Jews, or whether it belongs to the Christians. And I think the answer is that really it was a trialogue, at least among a lot, and maybe even you could say a quadrilogue with an ancient Egyptian kind of mystical idea.
Hermeticism. It's also interacting with Gnosticism. Plotinus even writes one of his treatises on the Gnostics, and they're also, and no insult, Paul uses some language that people have clearly identified as Gnostics, the powers and principality language. So he seems to have encountered that too. I'm not saying he's a Gnostic. I'm not making that move. That's ridiculous.
You're saying Paul of Tarsus, right?
Because
Paul Vanderklay is.
Paul Vanderklay is not beyond the Christian Reformed Inquisition. So
no, I meant Paul of Tarsus. Sorry, Paul. I'm doing a lot of indirect. I think that's right. I do think that's exactly what I think I want to agree with, like in a deep way. That's why I was trying to evoke this notion. I don't like, first of all, Neoplatonism, and this is Paul Vanderklay's excellent point. It doesn't start and stop with Plotinus. It doesn't even start with Plotinus and end with Proclus or Damascus or anything like that. And it's going off at times in a pagan direction, in parallel with a Christian direction, in parallel with I'm not proposing any sort of straight like that. I hope well, thank you for pointing that out, because that's something that should be clarified. I was emphasizing the fact that it seemed to have this particular power of entering into deep reciprocal reconstruction. So I think when Neoplatonism and Christianity meet, I think it's like a genuine marriage, reciprocal reconstruction. The Neoplatonism is changed and Christianity is changed, and both towards their betterment, I would say, by the way. Very much a dialogical process. They both get to places they couldn't get to on their own. But I want to say that I would be prepared to make the same claim about when it enters into reciprocal reconstruction with Islam or with Judaism. And so I think what you're pointing to is exactly what I want to say. I'm not billiard ball model. You're hitting a chicken and egg problem And I'm saying that's exactly the phenomena I want to highlight, that they're capable. It seems to have this functionality of doing this, right, with very profoundly developed systems of thought and practice, including science, the science of its day, the science of the 15th and 16th century, and the science of the early 20th century. That is what I'm proposing as it's a special appeal. So this is explicitly also why we can't just go back to wherever we throw a dart in history and say, let's go back to that, because it's exactly its capacity for reciprocal reconstruction. I like the Neoplatonism of Eriugena much more than I do of Proclus, for example. I think Eriugena gets much, much better, the emergence and the emanation. But, for similar reasons, I like Maximus better than I do like Porphyry or somebody like that. That's the phenomenon I'm trying to put my finger on. So sorry, I don't mean to be insulting. I know, I know sort of historical precedence is important for Christianity. It's part of your grammar of authenticity. I'm not I'm not trying to denigrate that. I'm trying to sort of say, can we sidestep that and say, no, I don't think we can determine that for the reasons Sam just said. And that's exactly what I want. I want something that is, its history is a history of dynamic reciprocal reconstruction. It by very nature is dialogical, and therefore it profoundly grounds and affords dialogos. So that's how I would want to respond, if that's okay.
Yeah. And so I think part of my response, and I don't even necessarily mean this as a critique, John, I bet that you'll probably agree with a lot of what I'm going to say, is that I kind of view Neoplatonism playing the role almost sort of like machine code does in a computer, but that it still needs a programming language kind of on top of it. It's almost like meta theology or something like that, or a structure that can bridge between theology and philosophy. Go ahead, John.
Well, I was just going to say, I was going to use a metaphor you had come very close to when you were talking about different languages, which is something like, with lots of caveats around it for the cognitive scientists who might be watching, please, okay? Something like Chomsky's universal grammar. I've read a couple of really good books where people have said, maybe there's kind of a universal grammar of intelligibility and a universal grammar of spirituality, and possibly they tremendously overlap or they exact from each other. And I think that's a very, very reasonable kind of proposal. So if that's what you're saying, I think something like that, very much like that. You see, what's interesting is Neoplatonism needs some, it needs some, so even within what you could call paganism, it's looking around, and it glums on to the Greek mythology, and then it does all this work to try and salvage, right, the Greek civic religion, right, and make it much more personally transformative, or it hits something, and we don't know what, in Egypt, and becomes Hermeticism, right?
It needs particularity. One of the things that Neoplatonism lacks in its purity is the particularity of an actual kind of religion, in the sense that I was talking about something that makes, informs, and sustains a group.
I think that's exactly right. So another analogy I would use, and I used it already, is Neoplatonism is at the level of the evolution of evolvability, right? Whereas Christianity or Islam is the evolution of traits that fit you to specific environments, historical contexts, traditions of practice, something like that. Because I've used that metaphor before, where relevance realization is like evolution. It's a universal process, but that doesn't mean that its products are all homogeneous. In fact, it predicts that the products will vary considerably. But it gives us a meta language from which we can stand back and say, you know why that functions by doing this, that functions by doing this, that functions by doing that. But here's why here's the source of functionality itself. It kind of makes those kinds of moves. That's exactly what I want to do. I want to say, okay, right, if we think that there is a shared look, and I think you agree with this, the evolutionary argument has to agree that to whatever degree other religions are surviving and spreading, they also have a profound functionality, right? So can we come, well, like, is there a code, a meta language, a universal language by which we could understand, you know, how functionality can connect to reality?
Mm-hmm.
Because this is the problem with the metaphorical truth argument. The metaphorical, well, it functions, but it's like, but like I said, if you keep truth and power disconnected, your ontology fragments in a deep way.
Yeah.
Sorry, I think I'm just repeating myself. I apologize.
No, that's good. I think that Neoplatonism was sort of helping describe something that was already there, right? It's sort of like there's structure and variation, right? Evolution has this, like lots of things have it, like music has this, like the blues, what makes a song a blues song? Well, there's structure, but there's also a seemingly infinite variation of possible blues songs. There's something that unites them structure. That structure affords variation, and that's why you don't just listen to the same blues song over and over again, right? You know, and in the same way, language is that, like, right, you know, Chomsky, like grammar. I know Chomsky is controversial, and I presume that's why you're putting some caveats before introducing him. But basically, there's some structure that affords the ability to have language, but then there's also lots of variability on that. And then I said the same thing. Religion seems to have something like that structure that allows you to be like, well, that's a religion, that's a religion, that's a religion, right? You're recognizing the underlying structure that makes them all the same thing, but there's variation. And that Neoplatonism seemed to be giving propositional articulation to what some of that structure was. And then once you have done that, that gives you greater clarity and leverage and degrees of freedom to interact with that in a more mindful and knowing way.
I want to add one thing to that, which is, in addition to doing that with religious systems, allow me to use system in a very like even organic dynamic way. It was also capable of doing that with other philosophies and the best science of its day. Right. So it's getting at something deep. It's getting at, like, it's kind of the grammar of intelligibility that is presupposed by both our knowledge projects and our wisdom projects, is one way I'm trying to think about it right now. And that, right, that allows us to say to which, okay, please take this very charitably, because I'm really exploring this. The degree to which, right, it marries with Christianity is the degree to which it can afford Christianity the ability to go from functionality to ontology, to make claims, right? Now, I understand Christianity was making claims about ontology, but what I mean is making claims that aren't tied to your allegiance to Christianity in order for them to be understood as viable and plausible. I mean, this is precisely, I think it's fair to say, this is precisely why a lot of people, you know, Augustine and Origen and Pseudo-Dionysius, it's precisely why they take up Neoplatonism. Is precisely because it served that, and this is a controversial word, and I mean something more than it has come to mean, but it served that apologetic purpose. It served a way, it made, and this was important to do, it made Christianity intellectually respectable. It said, no, everything and you know, you even see this in the Bible with Paul of Tarsus, right? What you're looking for, we are the culmination of it. Augustine easily presents Christianity that way, as the continuity and the growth of philosophy. He doesn't present it in, as far as I can tell, in any other way. So that's what I'm trying to, but I'm saying it also can do this for science. It can do it for Islam. Like, this is why I'm especially attracted to it, because of this. First of all, it's sort of, I want to call it its meta functionality, its ability to generate functionality, like you've been saying, Sam. And precisely because it is metafunctional, it can bridge between our merely metaphorical truths of functionality and our literal truths of ontology. That's the argument I'm trying to make. And I'm talking way too much. So
I don't think so.
I don't think so either.
Okay.
Well, conversations are not evaluated by the balance with which the partners. It's not a matter of the number of words; it's a matter of which words.
Yeah.
Which. So C.S. Lewis, in a letter to one of his dearest friends, when Lewis was coming into his urn, he was writing to Arthur Greaves. I bumped into this because I used it in a sermon recently. Talked about real things, and of course, Lewis was deeply Platonic. Lewis was a Platonist. Talked to Arthur Greaves about real things, and when he said real things, he said things such as, an apple is a real thing, and in some ways, part of the struggle we work with in this intelligibility, of course, attempts to connect, what I often call in terms of the two registers.
Yes.
The world above and the world below, heaven and earth. I mean, how much of this mapping is just so simply perennial? And part of, intelligibility is always going to have to account with history. And history, in a sense, is both the particularity, and I'm glad Sam mentioned that, but also the recursive, the pattern.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
And
the rhythm and the melody.
Well, yeah, and the event, the event, and the what the video I'm thinking of working on today actually works on your part in that rebel wisdom thing, and pulls that into some Northrop, Frye, and then a New Testament scholar that has an interesting lecture that someone sent to me. But ideally, then what I would imagine is whatever it is this is where our labels are always so difficult, but we'll use Neoplatonism as a sort of a good label to say, okay, this is a bridging label because we can see its relationship to, there's something that we've for a very long time been identifying as Neoplatonism that seems to be a bridge between all of these different functional religions that help individuals and communities map the particular and the recursive, the upper and the lower registers, and is something that is functionally cohesive for let's say narrative navigation. Because what we see with fully formed religions is that they sort of have the whole stack. You need a narrative, so again, when Lewis became a theist, which is probably for Lewis to the degree that his Platonism really took hold, as opposed to the skepticism.
Speaking of people very strongly influenced by Neoplatonism, C.S. Lewis also loved Neoplatonism and was very aware of all of that stuff.
Oh, yes. But so then when Lewis had to, of course, as an individual in history, in time, recognized that he could be an Oxford scholar and be a Neoplatonist and sort of float up here, but he recognized that he needed religio. He needed practice.
Yeah, very much.
And so then he looked around and said, okay, well, what's on the menu? And eventually he sort of came to Christianity or Hinduism,
right?
And eventually opted for Christianity because he said, I wanted something that seemed to have the most continuity between the village and the scholar, for Lewis, of course, being a scholar himself. And so then he would, go to his Anglican church and, sort of grit his teeth through lousy hymns and substandard sermons. And, because of course
Origen had the same problem.
Yeah. I mean, but for something, I mean, whatever the thing we're looking for, especially if we're looking for, let's say, and we're trying to get at an essence here that can the goal of every either search for the meta is always sort of above, or kernel, which is always below. And it's interesting how, we're not quite sure if we're looking for the kernel or we're looking for the meta. and I think that's a good indication that we're looking for something that in fact holds the stack together.
Yes.
Because each of our lives has, when C.S. Lewis says, real things like, not love in general, but love between these two people.
Yes.
We want something that holds the stack together. Mm-hmm. So, and people, there's huge variability both this way and this way in terms of people's lives, but we want something that's going to hold as big a world as possible, and that is both inside of us in terms of the capacities we have, but also the community.
Yes.
So that the community can, so that's both the internal scaling and then the communal scaling. And so, I like your proposal, John, for a variety of reasons. And that's why it's okay if you talk more than we do in this conversation, because you've presented something bold, but it's certainly got a lot to say for itself, given the historical record that we have, and also, some of the philosophical credentials that it seems to possess.
So thank you for that, Paul. Every time we talk, I love you more. Your capacity Merleau-Ponty talks about, contact isn't fusion, and it is right. We come into contact without confusion, and I appreciate that dearly. So I just wanted to take a moment away from the flow and just thank you again. You are, well, all of you are, but you in particular, Paul, you're often in my head. I hear your voice, not in some creepy fashion. I hear your voice in my mind, and I enter into dialogue with it as I'm trying to think about my ideas. I just wanted to thank you for that. Yeah. Two things about that. I think that's right. So take this sort of half jokingly. I don't think I'm a pure Neoplatonist. So like I say, I'm not nostalgic and I'm not utopic, right? And I recognize what both you and Sam are saying, right? Neoplatonism needs something. That's why Iamblichus introduces Eriugena and all of this stuff. But also that Eriugena is directly taken up by Pseudo-Dionysius. So again, it's the chicken and egg thing flowing around. In fact, I think we should stop calling him that. I think we should call him Dionysius the Areopagite, or however, whatever.
Areopagite, I think.
Areopagite, yeah.
Areopagite.
From the Areopagus, yeah.
Because they're now making a very good case that he's writing like under pseudonyms the way Kierkegaard did, right? That's not a fraud; it's a practice. It is a contemplative practice. Gregory Shaw, who wrote that great book on Iamblichus, has made that argument, and other people have too. And I think that's a really good way of understanding.
Although I will point out the Eastern Orthodox Church does kind of officially think that Dionysius the Areopagite was that person mentioned in the book of Acts. And
okay,
I'll just say I'm a little skeptical of
but
making
the Orthodox do that thing. The more I hang out with the Orthodox, it's like, they do funny things. I won't hold it against them.
Well, I want to say something about that in a sec, but what I was going to say is, and this is I sort of consider myself a Zen Neoplatonist because I combine Taoism and Buddhism, and that's how you get Chan. And then and then when it moves to Japan, it interacts with Shinto, a religion, and becomes Zen. And so I'm sort of a Zen Neoplatonist because I recognize that's me acknowledging your point, Sam, and I think your point too, Paul, that this can't just be sort of a philosophical structure. It has to become much more what Pageau talked about, philosophy of way of life. And as soon as you do that, it becomes inherently religious. Just like you really can't say if Stoicism's a philosophy or a religion. It hangs out right in that place in between. And of course, Stoicism has a huge impact on the development of Neoplatonism as well. The second thing is, and again, given my argument, this shouldn't be taken as any way denigrating or insulting. I think part of the reason for the attraction of Eastern Orthodoxy right now is because of its Neoplatonism. I think that, right, the fact that it has great art and liturgy attached to a pretty clear historical preservation and development. I mean, Maximus is one of the great Neoplatonists. He really is. And I hope that's not offensive to Eastern Orthodox, but
yeah, I don't think they would. And one of the other ingredients of Neoplatonism, and you see this even in early Middle Platonism, people like Numenius, is allegorical interpretations.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. I was just going to say that. Jonathan's strategy, and again, this is how he is more radical than people realize. Jonathan's strategy is exactly that strategy, the Neoplaton, and you see it also in Philo. Philo is already starting to do it too, right? And so, and this is very much a theurgic, right, Neoplatonic kind of thing.
And it's how Neoplatonism is able to integrate scriptural traditions into itself. Yeah.
But it's also how but it also affords scriptural traditions being taken into liturgical practice via Lectio Divina and other things. Again, I keep pointing out, it's this two-way reciprocal reconstruction going back and forth continually. And I think one of the things, again, we're careful enough. We've said this from the beginning. This isn't saying that Eastern Orthodoxy is right or true or better than what you have, Sam, or what you have, Paul. Who am I to make any ridiculous pronouncements like that? I just do not have what it takes, and I don't think anybody does. But I'm not saying that. I'm trying to explain just a specific thing right now. It's been noted in this corner of the internet that it seems to be, eminently attractive to people right now. I hear so many that people, I went to atheism and then I came back via Eastern Orthodoxy. And I do not think, I'm proposing to both of you, that is also not a coincidence. That is also speaking to the argument that I'm making here.
Yeah. I hear what you're saying, and I agree. I should talk to Jonathan sometime, Pageau sometime. That would be fun. But so one thing, hopefully this won't seem like taking the conversation in too big of a different turn. I'll kind of circle it back to keep the thread going in a similar direction. One person that I want to mention is Alvin Plantinga, the pride and joy of Calvin College. And so he had the evolutionary argument against naturalism that I think is very important. And Alvin Plantinga was sort of, he was kind of there towards the, he was in that more, what do you call courtroom style
analytic
dialogue between Christianity and atheism at the time. And like when he's talking with Daniel Dennett, right, that's sort of, they didn't do a very good job talking to each other, but that was sort of like Sam Harris and William Lane Craig were sort of popular apologetics, and kind of at the super academic philosophical level was Plantinga and Daniel Dennett. And I think that not to try and bring things back into the courtroom style, but I do think that Plantinga made an extremely important point in the evolutionary argument against naturalism that is kind of part of how I think that we were talking about the separation between the procedural and the propositional, right? Like religion could be propositionally true, but or it could be procedurally correct or functional at least, but propositionally incorrect in that it defends its procedures with the propositions. The propositions are just floating out in falsehood, mythological, untethered to reality land, but they generate procedures that are functional. And what Plantinga said to that was, well, wait a minute, you naturalists, you guys think that your minds are the product of evolution. And if you think that all that evolution is acting on is procedure, and that there is a disconnect between propositions and procedure, then evolution would not generate true propositions or even the ability to generate true propositions. It only cares about procedure. And so therefore, there is no reason for anyone to think that any of their propositions are connected to, propositional based reality or something like that. And so if you're going to make this split, then it's going to undercut the variability. You kind of alluded to this earlier, John, that it is that would be a skepticism that would shoot itself in its own foot. Because if there is no connection between propositional correctness and procedural correctness, then our brains have just evolved to deceive ourselves in a way that causes us to act properly. And so nothing that we could ever say or think could be very trustworthy. And so that there needs to be some connection there. But Alvin Plantinga, in his own sort of Dutch Calvinist kind of way, didn't give a very Neoplatonic answer, I would say, to that. He sort of gave the kind of the presuppositionalist sort of answer kind of thing, and basic factor, properly, things being properly basic, right? That was sort of his things and stuff like that. But I think that this is one of those things where Neoplatonism can help, I think, give a more thorough answer to why there is a connection between propositional correctness and procedural correctness. And it's sort of like what I was talking about with, polar bears and Mount Everest and forms and stuff like that. And that it has to be that there is a truth between what gets embodied, and the success of an embodied thing is a revelation about truth itself.
Yes,
right?
Well said, well said.
And that this is why I think that, even if I can't, there's still some other perhaps shortcomings to the evolutionary argument for Christianity, but it would be trying to use Neoplatonism to try and make this argument for the connection between embodied purpose and the structure of reality itself, and the conformity of when we describe the structure of something that's working, when we describe that accurately, we are conforming ourselves to that structure in a way that, can bridge between the propositional and the procedural.
That was beautiful. That was beautiful. I was going to respond to Plantinga the way you already did, and say, that argument's right. What Plantinga doesn't acknowledge, and I don't remember if Dennett brings it up, is that whole argument was also taking place within cognitive science. It's also in the air with people like Donald Hoffman. That's basically his argument, right? And he's certainly not advocating for Christianity, although I think when you press him, he turns into a Neoplatonism. I had a really good discussion with Joschel Bach on this. And I got to the point when I said, we did a very long, genuine dialogos, really. I was quite impressed with him. But we went through it, and if you get a chance, watch it. It's on the Theory of Everything channel. And I basically got to a point where I said, well, you're a Platonist. That's your actual ontology. And when you mean simulation, you mean it in a Platonic sense, not just in a matrix sense, although the matrix is probably Neoplatonic, right? But you know what I mean, right? And he acknowledged that. He said, yeah, that's probably right. And I think that's what would happen if you pressed on Plantinga. His basic presuppositions, I mean, Collingwood said it, when you get to your basic presuppositions, you're doing metaphysics. That's what metaphysics is. And the meta presupposition is that the grammar of your intelligibility, because that's what your presuppositions do, must connect in some important way, be in contact, not homogeneous, but conform to the structures of reality, or all you have is solipsistic skepticism, which undermines the science that you used to make the bloody argument in the first place, right? And so I totally agree with all of that. This is why I've been saying, right, that naturalism has to re-understand itself, not only as that which is derivable from the sciences, but that which is necessarily presupposed by the sciences, including cognitive science. And that leads me to the point you made. One of the things we're now realizing, I would argue, is the centrality of embodiment to cognition and to making sense. And this is one of the ways in which I explicitly reject classical ancient Neoplatonism, because it had a horrible attitude towards the body. And that is one area in which I think it got things wrong. I think it confused the body with the having mode, and it made all kinds of confusions around this that are no longer relevant or pertinent. I think they do more harm than good. And that, for example, part of Neoplatonism needs to be left behind. So very much, I'm in agreement with what you said. I think if you press on things like Plantinga, I meant his argument, but if you press on people like Plantinga about their arguments, you'll get to a Platonic, Neoplatonic kind of thing. And then I think one of the things we're realizing that we've always propositions presuppose the space of procedural knowing. That's how we move between our propositions, or else you get you try to fill all the space between propositions with propositions, almost like the Neoplatonists trying to fill all the spaces in their ontology. No, procedures are not propositions. They're the space with how we move between sets of propositions. But we also move between skills within perspectives. And we also move between perspectives within identities. And I think what's happening right now, I'm getting to the point, is we are, I think, uncovering, back to the 4 kinds of knowing, we're uncovering how deep the propositional network is, how deeply down it goes. And I would therefore argue that Neoplatonism talked about these, but we could do a much better job than ancient Neoplatonism did about disclosing the depth of our presuppositional network. And by the way, even saying that's hard because the presuppositions are not propositional, right? But that's the language I have to use, right? And that depth, we better have faith, hope, and love to invoke the theological virtue, that connects in some important way with the unfolding of reality, or we're trapped. We're trapped in an inescapable solipsism or skepticism that won't allow us to do the science. And then we get in this weird thing that the science took us to this, and then we discovered it's got to be that intelligibility conforms to reality. But we can't go back to the old way, because the old way we did that is, well, the structure of my experience and the structure of the cosmos are just identical. We're at the center and everything's going around. That doesn't work anymore. We have to, but that doesn't mean we can't recover or inventio, which I think we're doing, a new model of how that conformity works. The fact that the old model, and this is some of the things wrong with the old Neoplatonism, doesn't work anymore, doesn't mean a new way isn't possible. I think what we're trying to do, among other things, in this corner of the internet, to quote Sevilla's, and now I think she's even hashtagged it, right? Phrase is, we're trying to work out what does that new model of conformity look like. I put it to you, Paul, that's a lot of what you're trying to do. And I don't mean trying in the sense of feeling. I think trying in the sense of making, careful progress.
Well, I think, Sam, your phrase, the success of an embodied thing is a revelation about truth itself.
Yeah.
I think you could take a statement like that, and obviously for Christians who want to base their belief on the resurrected body of Christ, that there's it's the revelation of an embodied, it's the embodied thing is a revelation about truth itself.
The word became flesh. Yeah.
Yes,
that's right.
Yes.
That's right.
Yes.
The word becomes flesh, the incarnation, but science as well. I mean, the whole premise of science is that it is science, the study of, again, there's the individual, the particular, and the recursive or the pattern. Both of those things are revelation about truth itself. And the fact that perhaps one of the things that we find in science is the attempt to bridge or to somehow have intelligibility. And I love because that is, what we're talking about here, John. And as I think about, your role in this little corner, you have really succeeded in providing a grammar for all of us to talk about these issues. Mm-hmm. But to find the intelligibility between the recursive and the individual, one of the things that of course I was raised, Calvin was the place where I studied, and so someone like Plantinga, of course, influenced all of
Didn't you have either Alvin or Cornelius as one of your professors?
Or his brother Neil was
isn't his full name Cornelius Plantinga?
Yes. Mm-hmm. And so he was he was my systematics prof at the seminary, and he was my advisor for a while. And Neil is a that whole family is an astounding family. Their father taught psychology at Calvin. My mother took him and said, she didn't like him very much, but that's that. And that also goes to the fact of when you have a school, it is not a school is, to the degree that we talk about a school as purely an upper register theoretical thing, that school is diminished from the potentiality of all of the embodiment that goes into it. Mm-hmm. And so the intelligibility between the particular and the recursive is absolutely fundamental. Before, so I had, one of the things that I noted with Lewis was that in many ways Lewis made the same argument as Plantinga about the argument that you just laid out, and in fact Lewis attributes it before him. That argument has been moving around for quite a while, and one of the things that Lewis gets into is history itself, depending on your level of analysis, is on one hand always the recursive. And science, of course, is the scientific method is honed to bring the recursive into the upper register in terms of intelligibility. That is what science is for. Science struggles with the particular, the element that is outside the data set. And so, of course, what science is always trying to do is reach out and grow to say, okay, how does the particular fit into this data set? Right. But then, of course, Lewis goes on to make the point that all of history is a particular. I mean, there has never been, nor will there ever be another, now we have to use labels and names because that's the best we can do, John Vervaeke. I mean, he is a particular. Now, he is also full of recursion and just layers and layers and layers of recursion. And so we're always within this dynamic. And so that, I think, lends to the whatever on earth, because of course Gnosticism, and John, you've articulated this well, and others like David Bentley Hart have been articulating it recently too. Whatever we mean by Gnosticism, I think your point, Sam, basically validates that the embodied particular may not be excluded because we have not been able to necessarily enfold it within the recursive patterns that are very legitimate and that we see. But in that sense, reality, there's always suchness. Yes. There's always moreness. Yes. Yes. So no, this has been, this whole conversation, this dialogos this morning has been super, super helpful. And in terms of, okay, so when John talks about Neoplatonism, it's not just the Neoplatonism of Plotinus. No. And there's something that we're pointing to with this word Neoplatonism that is somehow embedded in Christianity and Judaism and many other, and it's embedded in the patterns of people who will never hear or have this word Neoplatonism be intelligible to them. And so the striving is to get at, okay, what is, and we don't even know we struggle to know what intelligibility itself is. That's my whole career. Yeah. But a worthy thing to spend one's life pursuing. Yes. I think that point, again, is very well said. I'm going to say something here, and it's making myself vulnerable into misinterpretation. But in many, many ways, I prefer Christian Neoplatonism over pagan Neoplatonism. Now, I have a special love for Plotinus because I think he's the first great synthesizer. He makes the synthesis of Augustine possible, of Eriugena, of Maximus, of
Origen, right? He makes it possible because, but I really love Christian Neoplatonism, precisely because of those two things and more. But let's say the Christian Neoplatonism really, it's also because of the contrast with the Gnostics, really embraces embodiment, right? But it struggles, and it's I'm not saying it's perfect.
Christianity always tugged Neoplatonism down in a certain sense and forced it to take materiality and embodiment more seriously than the pagan version often felt inclined to do.
And I totally acknowledge that, and I appreciate it, and I admire it. So that's clear. Well, I think that Christianity is still struggling with the relationship between embodiment, incorporation, and incarnation, because it invokes all three of these sort of.
What do you mean by incorporation?
We are all the body of Christ.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You say those three things again, John? I didn't get them down.
Embodiment, incorporation, and incarnation, right? Because they're related. I mean, the incarnation was some kind of embodiment, but presumably it has a kind of particularity to it. But like to your point, Paul, it has to somehow have a profound particularity and a profound universality, right? And so, right? And then, like I said, incorporation, which is somehow distributed cognition, has a distributed body that is somehow also related to the embodiment of each and the incarnation of the Logos. And I'm not going to say anything more. I'm just saying that I see that very much something that is still, we're like trying to get worked out, especially right now. Jonathan, for example, is talking a lot about incorporation and its relationship to incarnation, and Jonathan Pageau, right? And so I see that. So, but Christianity does that, and it anchors Neoplatonism to the earth and to the fertility and fecundedness of the earth. Totally.
And the goodness of the earth too.
And the goodness, well, that's what I was trying to allude to. Yeah, the goodness of the earth, precisely because it's generative beauty. But also because of Christianity's ability, and you can see Platonism, Neoplatonism struggling with this. It's trying to, Socrates started this, and you can see Plato and they keep trying to stretch eros and transform it, and they're doing it. But then Christianity comes in and says, you know what you're stretching towards? You're stretching towards agape. That's what it is. And it says the Logos and the agape are and I think that was an innovation that Neoplatonism was seeking, but pagan Neoplatonism was seeking, and couldn't quite generate it within itself. And so those two things, I think, make me appreciate and spend more time in Christian Neoplatonism than I do nowadays in pagan Neoplatonism. For that reason. One more thing to get back to the point Paul made. The point I made in Rebel Wisdom, and I've made it in another, I think who else I can't remember who I was talking to about this. I apologize. Well, about the hermeneutics of suspicion versus the hermeneutics of beauty. Right. The hermeneutics of suspicion is, right, it's born from the godfathers of postmodernity. This is a Ricoeur's point. It comes out of Freud and Marx and Nietzsche, right? And they are so now what we do is we suspect everything. There's a hidden motive, there's a secret agenda, there's a conspiracy. And the moment of truth is the moment where we uncover and we reveal, j'accuse, where we reveal, right, the conspiracy. And
the propositions are trying to deceive you into getting you to do the procedure that it wants.
Yeah, exactly. And this is prevalent. And then the point has been, it goes all the way back deeply into Plato, and you can see it running through into Hegel and Merleau-Ponty. Merleau-Ponty makes it really plain. He says, pay attention to, you cannot point to something as an illusion unless you're standing in something you take to be real. Illusions are parasitic on experiences, meaningfully structured experience, that you take to be in conformity to reality.
Right.
It makes no sense to say it's all an illusion. That's like saying everything's tall.
Right. Like when Daniel Dennett says consciousness is an illusion. Well,
and who's been an illusion to, and where is the illusion happening?
Yes.
Right?
Isn't illusion a conscious experience? Yes.
Yes. Yeah. It's like there's no illusion in physics in the sense of an ontological entity. There's mass and energy. Oh, and look, there's illusion, and it has, you measure it like, that's ridiculous. Okay, yeah, all of those moves I think are like mistaken. So the hermeneutics of suspicion is the idea that appearances are deceptive and distractive, right, and distorting, but they're dependent on the idea, not the idea, that's exactly the wrong word. They're dependent on the disclosure, right, the phenomenological realization of appearances as disclosing reality, as not being deceptive, as not being distractive, as not being distortive. And I put it to you, and this is D.C. Schindler, another Neoplatonist Christian, by the way, his proposal that should be the proper understanding of beauty, right? That beauty is when appearance discloses the depth of realness. And can beauty be hijacked? Anything anything can be hijacked. That's not a reason for rejecting it, right? So, and we have to remember, and this is Hahn's critique in Saving Beauty, we've reduced beauty to the smooth, to the pleasing. If you look in you read Plotinus says beauty is joyous, wondrous, and distressing. It should shock you. It distresses you. And, more recent thinkers, I should say, not modern, more recent thinkers like Scari about beauty, right? The hermeneutics of beauty is more primordial and grounding than the hermeneutics of suspicion. It is dependent on the hermeneutics of beauty. And I think this is one of the great claims of Neoplatonism. I've been reading a lot of theology, and that Balthasar, Schindler, Clark, all of these people, and it's no coincidence that they're deeply Neoplatonic, are pointing theology to beauty as where theology needs to go right now. That's not me imposing on them. That is what they are talking about, and they're opening, and I'm reading Balthasar's book on Maximus, trying to feed two birds with one stone, right? And like this stuff, the hermeneutics of beauty is exactly what I'm talking about. Beauty is when we have good phenomenological reason to believe that our appearances are disclosing reality. Our attempts to make sense, phenomenologically make sense, not just conceptually, lived make sense, are in contact with reality. I'm reading Meek's book on contact with reality. She's integrating Polanyi and Merleau-Ponty and D.C. Schindler, and this is exactly the same point again and again and again. And I think Neoplatonism, one more advocacy for it, right, gives us a place where we can properly talk about reprioritizing the hermeneutics of beauty. It's not, by the way, this does not eradicate the hermeneutics of suspicion. You need it, because there are conspiracies and there are cabals and there is propaganda, there is bullshit. But it's to properly reorient us to say, no, but that is ultimately always dependent on a hermeneutics of beauty. And Neoplatonism, and it's no coincidence that all these modern theologians are current. I want to stop using that adjective modern. All these recent theologians are using Neoplatonism to do that, because Neoplatonism makes that argument repeatedly. That's the ancient argument against the Gnostics.
Yeah. I mean, an evolutionary argument for beauty, a common discussion in evolutionary biology now is like, well, maybe does evolution evolve faster than pure random chance, right? Because and it seems to evolve way faster. And the neo-intelligent design people out there like to point out the mathematical problems that it doesn't seem like we've had enough time for random chance to do the job that it seemingly is attributed to have accomplished. And so the answer to that is, well, who says that evolution can't be faster than random chance? But what tools would it have to go faster than random chance?
Yes.
And one of them seems to be beauty. Like, why are birds so beautiful, right? And of faceted beauty is, it seems to be that one of the tools that birds use to evolve more quickly is both to get good at perceiving beauty and embodying beauty, right? sexual selection takes both those things. You need to get good at perceiving the thing that you want and embodying the thing that you want. Often the female is the selector and the perceiver, and the male is the embodiment and demonstration of beauty. And seemingly that seems to, be so useful that birds waste extraordinary amounts of energy on being beautiful, even at the sacrifice of being fit in other ways. Like being a red cardinal is not a particularly useful thing. Being a turkey with a giant, tail fan is not, useful, except in the fact that it communicates beauty, and beauty seems to communicate something deep about fitness. And why would that be the case if it wasn't if beauty weren't fundamental to the revelation of truth that comes through embodiment, like I was talking about?
Exactly. The argument that's made, and many people think they're sort of explaining beauty away, is no, what we're attracted to these features that disclose health and vitality and cognitive flexibility. We find humor beautiful, which is really weird.
Yeah.
Really weird. But
musical talent,
Yeah, why? Because what beauty is the appearances are disclosing the reality of the being. Right? That's what these arguments are actually presupposing. Can it get hijacked? It can, right? You have creatures that mimic and they're not really, etc. But that only works. That's, and pun intended, that's parasitic on beauty actually disclosing, right? Functioning to disclose the depths of some particular being, but also environments and perhaps even the world in general.
Yes,
I should get going soon, my friends. I really should get going soon.
Yes. Well, this has been really great. Maybe I'll give you guys a chance for closing thoughts. One topic I would maybe propose for a next future conversation is something that I think that we need to talk a little bit more about, is pluralism and particularism and Christianity's exclusiveness and its relationship to other religious traditions, and that whole topic. We mentioned it a couple times, but I think that is an important topic that maybe could be a teaser for a future conversation. And with that said, I'll pass the mic to you guys if you guys want to have some closing thoughts before we depart.
Go ahead, Paul.
I've just been, John, you've again and again proven to be just a terrific conversation partner, and you, whether you're doing things on video that I'm not on the same video with, or we're speaking together, you continue to impress me in how you pull things out and draw them together with an immense amount of generosity. And it's amazing how often I come out of a conversation with you, a dialogos with you, that I feel that, I've just been able to, I don't even quite know the metaphor to use, but the ball has been moved forward. And I'm amazed at how part of what we're playing with in this little corner of the internet is whether none of us can possibly watch all of each other's videos. That's true. But at the same time, we have sort of not a courtroom, but a courtyard, in which in these strange YouTube embodiments, we are in fact moving the ball forward. And if YouTube endures for however long it does, someone in the future might go back and look at our first conversation and then another conversation and another conversation. And so again, I see, the particular and the recursive. And so, every single one of our conversations are particular, and you and I are particularities, with a degree of overlap and a degree of disconnect. But along the way, I just feel tremendously grateful for having the opportunity to get to play as we've been playing. And so I just want to thank you both.
Well, I want to thank both of you. It's always a great pleasure. And I think there's often beauty when you and I talk, Paul, and that kind of beauty that draws us deeper. and Sam, this is now the fourth time I've been in direct interaction with you, and I've really appreciate it. You brought a tremendous amount of insight into this, and I found genuine dialogus for me. I found I was getting to places in what I was thinking and seeing that I couldn't have got to on my own, and I really appreciate the collective reflection. I'm happy to come back, Sam, for your proposed conversation. I think it's a conversation that is fraught and therefore has to take place within established fellowship, because if the fellowship isn't there, it quickly polarizes people. And I suspect, and I aspire that we will, of course, not, we won't agree, but I think we will, again, to use Paul's nice metaphor, I don't know which game we're playing, but we'll move the ball forward. And I think, I suspect, although not the hermeneutics of suspicion, but I suspect that ability to move the ball forward, the enactment of that is going to be more of the answer to the pluralism, exclusivism problem than any proposition that we managed to propose. And I'd like to see if we can bring that aspect into the conversation. Like I said, it's maybe the real existence of the courtyard is the answer to that problem, rather than some final theoretical conclusion about it. It might be that we could, I mean, this is a Tillich or a Kierkegaardian point. I'm reading a lot of Kierkegaard and about Kierkegaard right now. Carlyle's book on Kierkegaard, just like her book on Spinoza, was astonishingly brilliant. Spinoza's Religion, I keep recommending it. Yeah. Her book on Kierkegaard, Restless Heart or something, brilliant. Because Chris and I are going to do a series on Socrates and Kierkegaard very soon. We're working on it right now. But Kierkegaard's proposal that the answer to many of these is to live out a kind of tension, a kind of paradox that we can't, if we seek to resolve it, we always end up deforming something and making ourselves inhumane in a profound way. I'm not saying that I'm saying that's just uncritically right, but I want that perhaps brought into that conversation, that proposal. Obviously, we're going to discuss, and there's going to be lots of theory flying around, but I'm wondering if the enactment of the courtyard is how we properly respond to that issue, rather than saying, here is the blah that will like prove once and for all that Christianity is the one true religion, or prove once and for all that there is no, like, blah, 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 that kind of thing. Yeah. I mean, this is a way of trying to develop an idea I've had before about, you know, a different model of the evolution of relevance realization, rather than trying to come to some final place. That's why also not utopia, not nostalgia, but also not utopia, right? So
no,
I would like to perhaps suggest we bring in, if it doesn't rankle too much, the another innovation that Christian Neoplatonism made in the hands of Gregory of Nyssa, I believe, and taken up by Maximus, of epictesis, that we're not going to get to a resting place. We open into a God is the eternal affordance of endless self-transcendence kind of model. Maybe.
Yeah.
Anyways, that though, so great pleasure being here. Definitely committed to making it back here to another Dialogos about that topic, and making a request that we consider the enactment as a significant part of the answer to that, as to any particular propositions we might come to.
Mm-hmm. Well, I just want to say thank you. That was really beautiful, John. John, I feel like I've learned a lot from you. You've helped give me good vocabulary to articulate these things, and also you're one of the conversation partners I most look forward to, and I will even admit makes me a little bit nervous. I've told you that before. I'm getting more comfortable, and I don't think the nervousness is any really thing that it's just that you're capable of stretching me more than almost any other conversation partner I have. And that's both exciting and a little bit terrifying. And I also want to thank you, Paul. Paul, probably, almost certainly without you, I never would have started a YouTube channel. I never would have had the guts or even the idea to do this. And you've modeled so much of this for me that I'm just really grateful. So I'll leave that there. All right. Thank you, everyone. And I'll stop the video here.